Welcome everyone to this workshop titled Bearing Witness Online, Gender-Based Disinformation and Violence in Times of War. I am Taysir Mathlouthi, Senior EU Advocacy Officer at Hamle, and will be your moderator for this session. Arabic translation is available for those who need it. في كمان ترجمة بالعربي إذا بدكم اللينك راح يكون على chat. This conversation grows out of a workshop held at Hamle's Annual Convening in Brussels back in December, and it brings together two distinct but deeply connected bodies of work. First, new research from RNW Media and Hamle on technology-facilitated gender-based violence, with a focus on women media makers in the MENA or WANA region. And second, MIFTAH's practice of digital storytelling, which centers Palestinian women's own voices as a form of documentation and resistance. We'll open with a brief presentation of the research findings. Then Sarah will present and screen a short film produced by MIFTAH entitled Sounds of Hunger. We will then move into a facilitated discussion with your questions. Our goal today is not just to name these harms of online gender-based violence, but also to think together about gaps, responsibilities, and what more ethical and effective responses might look like. We would like to make this workshop as interactive as possible, so please do not hesitate to engage in the conversation via the chat or even by raising your hand, and I will give you the mic and share your questions with our speakers. Before I introduce the speakers who will guide us through this session, I also want to take a moment to note that this session might contain information and language that is triggering for survivors of gender-based violence. So please, your well-being is the most important, and you can judge by yourself if you are able to follow this session or not. So today, we have two incredible people who will guide us through this conversation. First, Giovanna Fleck. She is a journalist working on the intersection of technology and human rights. Her work spans critical areas, including reporting and researching digital policy, narrative analysis, disinformation, and ways to build healthier information ecosystems. She currently leads the information integrity portfolio at RNW Media. And we also have with us today Sarah Al-Khatib. She is a researcher and practitioner specializing in conflict management, humanitarian action, and transitional justice. She has experience with field research in contexts including Bosnia and Palestine, focusing on the social, spatial, and psychological impacts of conflicts. So today I will start with Giovanna with a question on your research. The research focuses on women media makers working in spaces where the patterns stood out most. What patterns stood out most in how disinformation is weaponized against women, and what surprised you?
Thanks a lot, Taysir, and thanks a lot to the Hamlet team as well for having us here and for opening this space for us to discuss technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Also in light of the fact that today is the last day of International Women's Day, so I think this is pretty symbolic that we are here and we're able to not only bring more attention to this topic, but also name things that remain unnamed in the information space as well, which we need to start bringing more momentum and attention towards. Maybe I can start just with a quick introduction of what RNW Media is and what kind of work we do. We are a media development organization based in the Netherlands, but working globally with journalists and media makers all over the world, trying to elevate journalism and journalistic practices to foster human rights and democratic values and try to make information spaces more inclusive and open, and trying to uplift those values as well by also understanding how harms and violence are deployed. And that's the core of our work on technology facilitated gender-based violence. We partnered with Hamle recently on a collaboration that was really interesting to put together and to hold those conversations and hold this space, because we wanted to particularly try to understand what are the implications of TFGBV. And I apologize very much, by the number of acronyms I'm gonna use in this workshop. Unfortunately, the language to talk about this specific subject is pertained by a lot of like difficult words and difficult acronyms. If anyone here has any suggestions of how to talk about it, or if you in your context has different language and ways to talk about it, even if it's in your specific language, we would be very interested to learn about it, because this is also heavily English dominated. So if you know of any alternatives, feel free to tell us on the chat. We're very eager to try to adapt a lot of this, because I think it's very non-inclusive at the same time, but also trying to be inclusive to different realities, which is difficult. But we were trying to understand in our research process how TFGBV is applied in the context of war and of civil restrictions most heavily. So one of the things that we chose, and because we have this body of work with journalists and media makers, was to focus on questions around censorship, self-censorship, and restriction of access to information as well. So one thing that we know for sure is that TFGBV is just routinely deployed by state and non-state actors. Also, one thing that is important to frame here is that when we talk about non-state actors, we're also talking about companies, and we're talking about platforms in that sense. And those tactics are used to discredit and silence people who are part of the public sphere in any shape or form. Namely, and just to name a few people that we try to interview and bring to this work: human rights defenders, politicians, journalists, media makers, activists, protesters, people who are participating in civil life in a way or another. We chose to focus specifically on women media makers because the representation of their voices in the information space bring different perspectives and realities. Without them, we're really at a big lose as an audience or as a global body of civic people, voices that are worried about what's happening in different parts of the world. And the erasure of their voices from this ecosystem really puts all of us at fault. You asked me, Taizir, at the beginning of the question, if there's something that surprised me in doing this work. And I am a woman from Latin America, and a lot of my work is centered in that region. I investigated and reported a lot on different forms of violence against women media makers and queer media makers in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. What surprised me from doing this investigation in West Asia and North Africa is how similar those tactics are. When we talk about a global playbook, when we talk about of tactics, I think it's also worth noticing that those are contextually based, but they are also global in a scale that we need to start paying more attention to how those things are deployed. And especially inside of environments, of digital environments, that were supposed to really democratize access to information and ways that we communicate with each other, those spaces are being weaponized against us. And we need to really pay attention to this. I want to cite some results from a research conducted by UNESCO last year, 2025, that shows that 70% of women journalists experience online violence in the course of their work. 70%. And women and queer folks, we are over half of the population of the world. And also in 2025, 42% of women journalists specifically linked to online attacks. They linked online attacks to offline abuse, offline forms of abuse and restrictions of their own power to inform. This is really more than just an escalating trend. I think this is systemic. And it's really driven by digital spaces and the way that they are governed, the way that there's decisions in their design, in the forms pertaining to those spaces. I always like to cite the research of Mariana Valente, who's a Brazilian researcher investigating TFGBV globally. And she says that digital platforms didn't invent racism, homophobia, transphobia, or misogyny, but they did invent ways to profit from it. And I think that's really the incentive that we see here. When we looked at Asia and North Africa specifically, research that RNW Media did recently shows that TFGBV is just widespread. 60% of women journalists report having experienced some form of TFGBV in the course of their careers. And one thing that is surprising when you talk to them is that they don't perceive the ecosystem getting any better in any shape or form. So this research that we did last year in 2025, we really tried to speak to women who are undergoing forms of threat, because their stories are something that we need to value and we need to learn from as well. So what we saw was that those findings spoke to a larger global reality in which those digital media ecosystems really align with conservative agendas and the broader rollback of trust and safety policy in general. We saw that women journalists or content creators, activists, and so on, they're subjected to coordinated attacks. So those are not isolated cases that are really designed to damage their reputation, their honor, or that in the context of their own cultures and religious beliefs as well, really driving them away from reporting on very crucial information, namely corruption cases. And especially those journalists and reporters working on sexual and reproductive health and rights, which are another terrible acronym. I really apologize for that. They are deemed as immoral. They are deemed as sometimes foreign agents, bringing in Western values that don't align with that particular agenda. And under that, there's a lot of repression that comes in with that type of discourse and the validation of those women and queer media makers or gender diverse folks. They're just trying to bring a perspective of sexual and reproductive rights into the conversation. There's a lot of stigma surrounding some of those topics in many contexts. Now, that also leads to women media makers being heavily sexualized and attacked. I think also one thing that is surprising here, or maybe not surprising, but still worth noticing, is that women in the context of journalism and media in many countries are also on the peripheries of access to important skills and information to one, counter or protect themselves, and also to be able to report in different formats in ways that sometimes men are much better and more exposed to. Those barriers are something that we also need to acknowledge. There's women being left behind in all shapes of forms, women and gender diverse people being left behind in all shapes of forms when we talk about TFGBV. But I think what our research shows is that all of that is really cyclical. You have the forms of attacks, you have the restrictions of power, and you have all of that leading to silencing and the patriarchy really putting those women or those folks in invisibilized spaces.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. Of course, the numbers we see, I think it's also important to mention it that we are today in 2026, and those numbers are not decreasing. Women and LGBTQI plus and gender diverse people are facing more and more violence facilitated by technology and by social media companies. You talked about the systemic issues. I also wanted to ask you about the tools that are enabling technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and especially the use of surveillance. So, can you say more about how tools like spyware connect also to broader campaigns of harassment and defamation, and what that looks like in practice for the women you studied? And for women specifically, how does this gendered surveillance reshape their daily life, their self-expression, and simply the decision to speak publicly?
I think I am muted. I think it's working. Thank you, Daisy. Yeah, surveillance, unfortunately, is one key component of TFGBV, and it's something that we really need to pay attention to because it's sometimes hard to try and harder to understand because it's not like just having a camera or your device being monitored and so on. I think surveillance in this context is also about cultural adherence and patriarchal surveillance from cultural practices too. When we set out to investigate how this really plays out in the mental and sometimes even physical awareness of journalists, we saw that in general, girls, women, and queer communities, they really face unprecedented levels of policing and societal scrutiny over their daily lives and their identities. And even like most basic behaviors, decisions, like their appearance, how they talk, their movements, relationships, and so on. So this really can have very, very deep, entrenched repercussions in their fundamental freedoms and even their bodily autonomy and their integrity in general as well. And I think one key part of that is that our independent features or identities, those in the current economy, systematized as data points inside of systems that not necessarily were designed like spyware, but can also be used for surveillance. And I think there's a component of data governance and data protection here that we need to acknowledge and talk about. Because whenever those are not protected, and whenever the initial goal is selling you ads, that can also be weaponized, and especially in context of conflict and context of violence. That's really what we see. I think that causes a big chilling effect on people that often leads to self-censorship. We can cite an example of this. We interviewed a Iranian human rights advocate whose phone was targeted by Pegasus in 2019. Pegasus being the spyware developed by the Israeli company NSO. And she previously stated that as a result of surveillance, she couldn't feel safe at home. Her home, which used to be the space where she would create and be able to really engage with the community she was working on, became a space of deep tension and unsafety. Like if you have no space to practice your own work and not only work, to relax, to be able to be yourself, and there's no space where you can actually live freely and live a life. That's really, really, to me, one of the factors that is I think the most cruel about all of that. Is it really TFGBV is one of those frameworks that really takes out safe spaces of people that need them the most. And I think there's been so many similar reports happening all over the world as well. I can connect those with things that I saw in Latin America and so on, journalists that have been targeted. But I think that also leads to other fears that are also embedded in different forms in which your data or your information can be used against you. And I think that also needs to be placed in the context of the patriarchy again, and how women oftentimes are the primary caregivers of their families. So if your data and sensitive information is on the brink of being leaked or used against you, that also means that it might be your family or your friends or your support system that might be targeted again. And that really puts you you as a targeted victim in a real position of kind of like defenseless as well. Because what can you do to protect them other than silencing yourself? And oftentimes, those types of attacks and forms of self censorship go deeply underreported. We don't know about them so much. And I think it's one of the key things that we need to pay most attention to if we can. Because usually self censorship is the first thing, or the biggest indicator that our freedoms as a collective are being restricted. And when it comes to women media makers and journalists and queer media makers and journalists, gender diverse people being silenced, we're all at fault because we all depend on the information that they produce. us, people who might want to be informed about what they're reporting on.
And you also mentioned something that is quite interesting in your introduction. You specifically mentioned that technology facilitated gender-based violence comes from states, but also non-state actors, and you specifically mentioned companies. So I also wanted to talk about the double standard when we zoom in. When we zoom into Palestinian women's content and how their content is specifically removed and suppressed at very, very large scales. And but at the same moment, hate speech that is targeting directly targeting them is always left unchecked by those platforms. So how does that asymmetry function as a form of gender-based violence by itself? But also, what does it tell us about those social media platforms and how they are protecting women, diverse gender diverse people, LGBTQI+, queer people, etc.?
Remember that last year we also collaborated on a policy brief about specifically citing Meta's conformity with requests to put down Palestinian content that would actually be in accordance with their own platform rules, kind of like showing this choosing sides basically, and choosing to limit access to Palestinian created content. And I think this relates as well to previous interests that I briefly mentioned, and I think we're going to talk more about in the panel later on. Inside of RNW Media, we've also been working quite heavily on narratives and the formation of narratives and how framing happens in different social media spaces. Actually, like in doing this work, we cannot disconnect it from the interest behind narratives. Narratives being formed do pertain to certain interests from state and non-state actors and are pushed by largely algorithms shaped by people that, I don't know, might agree or disagree with this context, regardless, are still being part of the conceptualization of those algorithms. One thing that we saw across our research as well, those narratives and those forms of violence that happen inside of certain platforms largely include bullying, threats of violence, rape threats as well, sexual violence. And those are freely circulating inside of those so often. They shouldn't be. There's been a lack of moderation. There's been a lack of investment in truly trying to moderate those platforms in a way that would be according to human rights frameworks, for example. And that's intentional. That's severely intentional. We're seeing recent lawsuits as well that those platforms are definitely not interested in the well-being of their users. And I think a lot of those decisions came from the expectation that certain platforms would self-regulate. We just see that this is definitely not the case. It's also hard to estimate how much they make out of TFGBV in general, which is also one huge gap in research that we have, because those platforms have limited researchers to the APIs and backend code that would allow us to ask those questions and do those investigations. But there was a figure recently in a study that showed that on YouTube, gender-based disinformation and forms of violence, especially against women, make YouTube over 3 billion pounds. This study was in pounds, so I think it's something like 3.9 billion euros a year. I can link it to in the chat later if anyone is interested. But it's a lot of money, and it really rains heavily when it comes to profiting over different forms of violence. At the same time, you see that type of information is heavily weaponized against the the people that are trying to raise awareness against them. I think there's this largely documented cases of when Israeli military was using information on sexual behaviors to blackmail Palestinians, especially Palestinian women, in collaborating with its agencies that before October 7th. In collaboration with Hamlet as well, we wrote about how since October 7th, queer Palestinian women living in Israel have reported that they have been facing threats from Israeli users of being outed, of having their gender or sexual identities disclosed without their permission in order to collaborate and express open support to Israel. Hamlet also showed that Palestinian women are subjected to political gender violence, and that's been used as a weapon of war as well. So we're also not talking about how those spaces and platforms profiting over certain behaviors, but we're also talking about how they are helping and aiding a political agenda that is in conformity with genocidal practices. I think there are levels of harm here that are highly severe and go very much underreported as well. That all with the background that within this specific war, over 250 journalists have been killed. So you don't only have the idea of you have the documentation of actual deaths of all those reporters and documentaries and media makers that have already lost their lives, and us as an audience who have lost their perspectives and their ability to report on what's happening on the ground. But we also have this whole context of censorship that is limiting people who are victims of TFGBV from also being part of the information ecosystem. And I think there is like part of this cyclical process that really needs to be acknowledged. We need structural responsibilization for that, because those are not individualized cases. I think that's what, in general, what our research and partnership try to show. Those are structural choices. And that's what we need accountability for.
Thanks a lot, Giovanna. We really see how those platforms are at the same moment profiting from gender-based violence and silencing women voices. And when we look at Palestine nowadays, the strategy of silencing Palestinian voices, whether women's voices or not, is a strategy that has been highly used. And Palestinians are also asking to just bring back their voices, to be able to be heard by the others. And we see in the current genocide the strategy with the fact that even international journalists couldn't enter the Gaza Strip, and how it was also intended to make Palestinians journalists and women journalists seen as not legit ways of getting information, not legit journalists, not legit enough to share their lived experiences. And that's also why I think it's really important today to have Sarah with us, because your work at MIFTAH is really impressive, and how also MIFTAH is bringing back the voices of Palestinian women, voices of Palestinians in general, but also how you bring new digital storytelling techniques to bring back their voices to the center, and how important it is also for Palestinians to be the ones leading their storytelling instead of someone else telling their story. So Sarah, please, if you could present your work, but also you have this short movie that MIFTAH produced that you will screen. Yeah, I think that everyone is excited to watch it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Taysir, and thank you, Hamla. Again, it's great to be with Giovanna on this. So just a little bit about MIFTAH. It is an independent Palestinian civil society institution committed to fostering the principles of democracy and effective dialogue. The main work we do started as political concern, especially opening dialogue on final state issues. But currently we are focusing on disseminating the Palestinian narrative, both locally, regionally, and internationally. So every year, MIFTAH produces a number of short films. The main focus of these films is to shed light on the lived experience, to give voice to those stories that get lost between the cracks of all the crises we live day in and day out. And Sounds of Hunger is just an example of that. So it is a 7-minute short film. It highlights a couple of the testimonies that we collected from Gaza during the famine. However, we have around 70 of them, so the short film does not do justice to all of the testimonies we have collected, but it does highlight a pattern, which I think will be clear to the viewers once they get the chance to see the movie. I'm gonna try to share it, bear with me. Is it good?
Sorry, Sarah, I could see it for a moment, but now I'm not sure. Taisir, do you?
Yes, it works for me.
Is it working?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you see it, Giovanna?
No, but maybe it's a problem on my end, and that's okay. No worries. If it works for everyone, then it's okay.
During Israel's ongoing genocide on Gaza, Palestinians have been facing not only direct bombardment, but also starvation, as aid has been weaponized by Israel. MIFTAH's field workers collected testimonies from women in Gaza facing starvation, who detail the horrors they and their families have been facing under this forced famine.
أعيش اليوم حربين لا حرباً واحدة، حرب القصف والدمار وحرب الفقر والجوع والمرض. لقد أصبح الحق في الغذاء مجرد حلم بعيد. صمودي مستمر، لكنه صمود مشروط بالألم والمعاناة.
غالباً ما أتناول وجبة واحدة فقط في اليوم، وأحياناً لا أتناول شيئاً. تدهورت صحتي الجسدية والنفسية، وبدأت أعاني من ألم مستمر في الساقين وضعف عام ودوخة، إضافة إلى ازدياد عصبيتي وتوتري بشكل يومي.
بعد شهرين من انقطاع الطعام والخبز والطحين، أعطتني حماتي 4 أرغفة خبز من أجل تجهيز الفطور للأطفال، حيث أعطي كل طفل نصف رغيف محشو بالعدس المحمص. عندما شاهد ابني الصغير الخبز قال: يا رب ينزل صاروخ كل أهلي يموتوا مشان أضل لحالي وأكل الخبز لحالي وأشبع.
أشاهد أطفالي يتغيرون، ضحكاتهم اختفت، لا يطلبون طعاماً، بل فقط ينظرون إلي بعينين غارقتين بالخوف. ابنتي ذات 10 سنوات قالت لي مرة: ماما، لو متنا هل سنجد في الجنة خبزاً؟ لم أجد رداً، فقد حضنتها وبكيت.
بعد ولادتي بأسبوعين فقط انتهت الهدنة وعادت الحرب من جديد، ومع اشتداد القصف بدأت الجمعيات تقلل توزيع المساعدات. أنا أم مرضعة وطفلي لا يشبع من الرضاعة الطبيعية ويحتاج إلى حليب صناعي، لكنني لا أستطيع تأمينه.
نفسيتي محطمة، أشعر بأنني عبء على ابني، لا أستطيع النوم ولا الحركة ولا حتى البكاء. كل ما أريده هو أن تتوقف هذه الحرب وأن أتمكن من شراء دوائي وأرى أحفادي يأكلون خبزاً ساخناً مثل باقي البشر.
ازدادت المعاناة حيث انقطاع المساعدات على منطقة شمال غزة وغزة. اضطررنا لإطعام أطفالنا بديلاً للدقيق ما يعرف بأعلاف الحيوانات. نجمع باقي الأشياء المبعثرة على الرمال مثل الأرز والعدس وغيرها. وتم إيجاد بدائل لقصة الدقيق مثل عجن المعكرونة والعدس والأرز وغيرها. لم أكن مهيئة للنزوح من مكان لآخر أنا وطفلي. مع عدم توفر الطعام لجأنا إلى كثير من الطرق البديلة، أكل الأعشاب والنباتات البرية التي يكثر انتشارها بالمقابر، بالإضافة إلى تحويل أعلاف الحيوانات إلى دقيق رغم خطورتها، ولكن لا بديل.
أصعب شعور في الدنيا هو عندما يطلب ابني أو ابنتي الأكل ولا أملك أي شيء لأقدمه لهم.
أغلقت المعابر بالكامل وتوقفت المساعدات الإنسانية من غذاء ودواء وطحين. اضطررت لاستخدام معكرونة مطبوخة وملقاة أمام تكية قديمة جففتها وأعدت تشكيلها كخبز. جميع أطفالي يعانون من فقر الدم، سوء تغذية وهشاشة عظام، ولا أستطيع تأمين احتياجاتهم الأساسية.
أحياناً يتنازل زوجي عن وجبته من أجلنا، وأحياناً أتنازل أنا لأنني لا أحتمل أن أرى أطفالي ينامون جوعاً.
لقد قمت بوضع حبوب الحساسية في المياه، وقمت بإعطائها لأطفالي ليناموا ولا يسألونني عن الطعام.
كنت أعتمد على أحفادي الصغار الذين يسيرون يومياً مسافات طويلة تصل أحياناً إلى 15 كيلومتراً للحصول على وجبة واحدة فقط، وقد يعودون أحياناً خاليي الأيدي.
تعرض ابني الأوسط لحروق بالغة في قدمه جراء انسكاب طعام التكية عليه. يومها اضطررنا لطلب بعض الطعام من الجيران. أما ابني الصغير فيعاني من إصابة ببطنه من العدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة عام 2014، حيث اضطر الأطباء لإجراء عملية إزالة الأمعاء واستبدالها بأمعاء بلاستيكية. مع قلة الغذاء أصبح ابني يعاني من آلام شديدة في البطن، فمن شروط الأمعاء البلاستيكية أن تكون ممتلئة على الدوام.
الصغير يبكي دون دموع، والكبير لا يتكلم ولا يضحك. أصبحوا أولادي مثل النباتات اليابسة، يلتفون على أنفسهم ويرتجفون ليلاً من الجوع والخوف. أما أنا فتغيرت تماماً ولم أعد قادرة على النهوض. وفي يوم من الأيام فقت من النوم، وجدت ابنتي الصغيرة تمسح على وجهي بمنديل مبلل وتقول: يا ماما لا تموتي، بدي أضل بحضنك. واليوم أتحدث وأنا تحولت إلى ظل إنسانة أردد بيني وبين نفسي كل يوم: سأبقى فقط يوماً آخر، لعل العالم يسمعنا.
So yeah, this is definitely one of the heaviest productions for MIFTAH, even for us as a team. It was one of the first sessions where I've witnessed colleagues have to leave the room multiple times. And it took us much longer than these films usually take. Nonetheless, I think more can be found, of course, about this topic, details, and all of the testimonies in MIFTAH's full report. It's on the website. I can share the link shortly in the chat box. But I think that what I want to highlight here is the couple of questions which we struggled with as a team working on this. So, for example, the continuous question was, where is the fine line between the risk and the responsibility of documenting something, but also respecting the people and their experiences, especially in a digital space where everything is there forever. Additionally, there was this constant question, especially among women, in the team is that how can we amplify these women's voices without reducing them to symbols of suffering? Because the whole notion of a woman being either a sole victim or a resilient, amazing star that suffers no consequences of the situation she is experiencing, in both cases is not an honest representation of the lived realities of women, especially in Palestine and more specifically in Gaza. So the first question we were asked is, why women's testimonies? Many argued that possibly having children's testimonies, for example, might be more impactful, which is, after all, what all of us want on a digital space. It's the trend and the impact. So why women's testimonies? I think the main reason subconsciously was that women's testimonies in Palestine have always existed. In homes, in oral histories, in refugee camps, in prisons, and in hospitals. It is the stories of Nakba that lived beyond their survivors through grandchildren and granddaughters for generations to come. But the digital sphere has transformed testimony from this intimate space of family relations and the home into something accessible for the public. The change in taking testimonies into this space, much wider, much more open, has involved accelerated circulation. It has altered what audience mean and who we are talking to, but has also, most importantly, changed the conditions of visibility. With that, women are positioned through their words as mothers, caregivers, medical workers, survivors, heads of households in crisis and beyond. Their testimonies disrupt the dominant frames that either militarize Palestinian identity or depoliticize it as mere victims. Instead, women speak about hunger, fear, loss, dignity, daily survivor, and care under collapse, actively expanding through their testimonies that count as political and what defines their experiences. In many of MIFTAH's report, infographics, short films, and social media content, women's voices are not supplementary. As you've seen, they are the foundation to documenting the lived realities in ways that statistics simply cannot, and in many cases are not interested in. Rather than aiming to produce generalized conclusions of what the experience of a woman in Gaza is, we do not require multiple testimonies to confirm identical experiences to validate what this woman is communicating to us. Instead, we create a space for women to narrate how shared conditions affect them differently and how their social and political positionality shape their experiences under the same conditions. In doing so, testimonies that once circulated primarily through intergenerational storytelling become something else in the digital sphere. They become evidence, archive, counter-narrative in many instances, and ultimately, for organizations like MIFTAH, an advocacy tool. So when we translate testimony into the digital advocacy, something shifts. Many questions arise. So some that we still battle with today. For example, what sentences do we highlight? What images accompany her words? Do we show her face? Do we name her? What context do we provide? And the hardest of all, what do we cut? From all of the testimonies we received, I believe if put in a footage, AI says the footage would go on for 4 hours and 32 minutes. So cutting that into our 7 minutes, as you can imagine, was a struggle. There are no neutral editorial decisions. We do not claim objectivity. They are ethical and political decisions shaped by, sadly, the nature of the digital space, the algorithms, the reduced attention spans of Gen Z, economy pressures, political urgency, censorship risks, and safety concerns for the victims and for the people working on this production. We do this with the realization that digital platforms reward emotional intensity. Thus, why a teammate suggested children. But ethical storytelling requires restraint and respect, and this is the area where tough tensions exist: visibility and protection, impact and dignity, as well as urgency and consent. So actually, when we think about it, our grandmothers as Palestinian women never told us about their Nakba traumas when we were little, when we were vulnerable, when we did not have the tools to understand or imagine how it was. They chose the right moments. So they did transfer the experience through their testimonies at the right time and place. Unfortunately, controlling that on digital spaces is much more harder than my grandmother's living room. So that is why this becomes a responsibility on us, the ones that have the data and are able to choose what gets out. So this is actually where I want to slow down when it comes to the ethical tensions. When women bear witness online, they are not only speaking, they are exposed. With protection of survivors being a top priority we must grapple with, we had to ask, did she consent to being interviewed? Because a lot of these interviews just exist online. Well, yes, but did she consent to global circulation of that interview, for it to be able to be replied over and over and over at international arenas, or for example, online, like I just did? Did she want this to be archived permanently? Does she want her voice or image out there? These questions are what keeps our use of women's testimonies ethical. The fact that they keep arising during discussion. With the understanding that digital testimony does not disappear, MIFTAH usually refrains from using identifiable information. For example, as you've seen in the video, just a second. As you've seen in the video, we usually do not include the names. We just include the first letters of the first name and the last name. We also try not to use people's voices. We have volunteers and people in the team that take on the testimonies and record their own voice saying it. So we have developed these little tools to help make communicating these testimonies equally as impactful but more ethical. Instead, we also highlight how testimonies intersect and speak to each other. I think the video highlights this perfectly because, as you've seen, no two testimonies are identical, but all of them are saying the same thing. There is a famine. The human suffering is unbearable, whether you're a mother, a child, a grandmother, a sister, a woman, with children, without them. So this is what is generalized. It is that the situation is unbearable, but the experiences and the individual understanding of them and processing has earned the respect for it to stand alone without us needing, for example, 20 women describing the same incident on the same day in the same place to give it this validity. When it comes to another subtopic in this, I want to highlight is the gendered emotional labor of narration. I think that this often gets lost, especially when we're talking about women's testimonies, because, for example, in our reports and advocacy materials, we gather the data through trained field researchers with a lot of understanding of the emotional labor behind the rating. Even so, when women share their experiences, they are often expected to perform a difficult form of emotional labor, which is unrecognized. They are asked to recount trauma, articulate suffering, represent community pain, and humanize the catastrophe enough for the viewer to be able to relate and empathize, while still living through the very conditions they are describing. While testimony can be politically powerful, it can also become extractive if these dynamics are not approached very carefully by the people collecting the testimonies and later on dealing with them. Another thing that came up during our work, not only on Sounds of Hunger, but also Sounds of Gaza, for example, is that there is this global appetite for Palestinian suffering. When the testimony educate, and when does it become consumable tragedy? So what testimony is providing the viewer with the information they will need to become an advocate for a certain cause, and which is just consumable tragedy for the online appetite for suffering and blood. So it is important to remain aware that increased visibility does not automatically translate into deeper understanding or political accountability. In many cases, it does the total opposite. When testimonies are repeatedly framed only through loss, hunger, grief, there is a risk that suffering becomes something audiences consume rather than confront. Women are not only witnesses to suffering, they are also organizers, professionals, caregivers, political actors. Gaza has had the biggest number of orphans in the world and has found ways to deal with them under conditions of genocide and famine. So we have these women doing this incredible work under incredibly impossible circumstances. But sometimes when we focus only on the loss, this important information and these important roles that women also take in their communities get lost. So ethical storytelling must preserve the complexity of identities. No certain woman can be summarized in 2 sentences of her testimonies when she saw a child hungry. It is important to realize these women are people with complex identities that deserve the respect to these identities and the different roles they play every day. I would just sum it up here quickly. So as people working on Palestinian advocacy and digital advocacy through these films, we understand that we have constant structural risk, content removal, shadow banning, account suspension, algorithmic suppression, frequently affected Palestinian content online, and MIFTAHs. Testimonies that describe violence, hunger, or displacement are sometimes flagged as sensitive, graphic, or political. Silencing often happens quietly through reduced visibility rather than explicit removal. This raises a difficult question for those engaged in digital advocacy. How do we amplify women's voices in a space that structurally limits Palestinians' voices? And how do we increase visibility without exposing women to additional harm? Based on MIFTAH's experiences, several guiding principles have emerged in navigating these challenges. For example, always dignity over virality. The goal of advocacy should never come at the expense of humanity of those stories that we have. Second, contextualization over sensationalism. Testimonies become more powerful when it is situated within broader political and structural analysis. Third, multiplicity over singular victimhood. Women appear in testimonies not only as victims, but as doctors, students, researchers, mothers, community organizers, and leaders. Ethical storytelling reflects this complexity. And fourth, protection as political care. And this is our responsibility. Finally, archiving as resistance. Digital testimony is not only advocacy in the present moment, it also contributes to the long-term documentation of lived realities that might otherwise be erased. In the context of 2026, ongoing occupation, bearing witness is not passive. It is an act of defiance. When Palestinian women speak online, they challenge erasure, dehumanization, and the dominance of narratives that exclude their voices. But amplification must be intentional. If we are not careful, digital storytelling can reproduce harm even if it seeks justice. So the question is not only how we make women's testimonies visible, it is how we make them visible ethically, politically, and strategically in ways that strengthen rather than exhaust Palestinian digital narratives and Palestinian women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. The movie is so moving, and I was thinking while you were speaking how important it is also to change medium. We get so used to watch news and videos on social media platforms, and those platforms desensitize what we feel about genocide, about war. We get used to those horrible images and just take 7 minutes of our time to really watch a movie. To only focus on this is really important because it also changes the way we take care of the information that is given to us instead of just scrolling and get information from media outlets or TV channels. So I just wanted to say thank you, because it's a strong movie, and I really hope that the movie will also have a long life, and that you will be also able to show it to as many people as possible. But I also wanted to, just 2 points. Carol Abu Musa just asked if you altered the movie in any ways with AI systems. I don't think it's the case. What you mentioned is that like other people were putting their voices, but not the people who testimonied. So I think you answered the question, but I just wanted to be sure. That's my first point. And then I just wanted to go back to this idea of consent, because we are consenting on a very they consented on like sharing their testimony for this specific movie. But then do you have any plan for like in 10 years, will this consent will still be valuable and useful, or do you also need to go back to the woman you interviewed, and if they still agree on sharing their testimonies? Because I think that when we work, for example, in a nonprofit on communications and advocacy, you sometimes need to ask people to give consent for only a specific period of time. Is it the case, or do you have also tips for this situation? And then just the last point, and I know that we need to wrap up, but on trauma conception, what are the tools? And I think this question is for you, Sarah, but also for Giovanna. How your work and the work that already exists on those topics can also tackle the issue of trauma consumption, and how difficult it is for survivors of gender-based violence to get back to those type of content. So what are the tools you have, the resources, if you have any tips you want to share with the people who are listening to us? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Taysir, for that. So yes, your answer to the AI point was correct. I'm not going to add anything to that. When it comes to consent, all of our testimonies are collected by field workers. They are very well trusted within their communities. So in every governorate in the West Bank, for example, we have field workers that are known and trusted in their own communities. They stay in contact with all of the women and the people that provide their testimonies. Whenever we share a post, do a fact sheet, policy brief, short video with any of these testimonies included, we go back to the people, double, triple, quadruple check. We also sometimes share drafts if this is something they would prefer before consenting, and we offer withdrawal at any point. It has happened multiple times where we would have to put something out there and then take it back. Because respecting the people and the testimonies they give is the top priority. Honestly, no production is worth the trauma you can cause someone of having their testimonies out there when they would prefer not to have it this way. Most of the testimonies are collected in a written format. We have found that these are much easier. They help with the emotional labor of discussing traumas, and they are also less traumatizing compared to talking it out loud. Psychology has evidence that show that sometimes talking about your testimony, giving a testimony, and then watching the facial expression of the listener influence how you feel about it and how you process it as an experience. While rather, if you write it down, that remains your experience and your interpretation of what happened. And finally, on the trauma consumption, I think this is an issue. Even me as a user of social media and someone very interested in world politics faces, is that the first video shocks you and then after that you feel nothing. And I think this is intentional, just to a very large degree. But I believe that not only changing the format helps, but also trying to understand that trauma consumption comes from a place where people want to feel something. And the only way for them to do so is to see that shock, because they are not experiencing it firsthand. So it has to be so shocking through the screen for them to experience a certain feeling. And I think that is why these images, these horrific testimonies are being publicized, because people need that first shock to actually feel the emotions. Nonetheless, I believe there is nothing equal as talking to people. It is very difficult to consume a trauma. Once you see a face for it, you hear its details, see its family. So once it becomes a person, not an it is very hard to consume it, no matter how much one is hungry emotionally, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that we need to wrap up, but I saw, Giovanna, that you added your resources directly in the chat. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank both of you, but also the people who were here today to listen to us. Lots of great comments in the chat, and I really think that 1 hour is not enough to speak about this topic and those issues. And I really hope that we'll have the chance to continue this conversation. Feel free to follow MIFTAH's work, but also our NW Media work, because you'll find so many important research, but also stories that you can always read and follow. Thank you so much, both of you, and I hope to see you very soon.